Hey, traveler. Tonight, I thought we'd talk about medieval duels. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if someone publicly insulted you? In our modern world, maybe you'd write a strongly worded tweet, but medieval people, things got a little more personal. The difference was that reputation wasn't just about social media likes, it was about survival. Sure, a scathing tweet can sting, but an unchallenged insult in medieval times could erode your social standing, your business prospects, and even your family's future. When your alternative was societal ruin, suddenly a sword fight looked like a reasonable option. Long before reality TV drama, medieval society was obsessed with honor. Imagine it as their social currency, carefully guarded and easily depleted. Honor wasn't just about being good, it was about being seen as good, brave, and capable of defending yourself and your family. This reputation was everything: your access to resources, your ability to form alliances, and even your chances of staying alive during tumultuous times. To lose honor was to become an outcast, a pariah, someone no one could trust. It was like getting cancelled, but with real swords. Picture this situation. A lord accuses another of cheating during a dice game. Today, maybe they'd argue, hire lawyers, or even take it to small claims court. But in the medieval period, such an accusation could escalate into a duel. Why? Because the accusation implied dishonesty, which directly attacked the accused's honor. It suggested he was not a man of his word, not to be trusted in business deals, and incapable of upholding his oaths. What about using a referee or using a mediator? Nope. Only blood could wash this stain. Essentially, it was medieval conflict resolution powered by testosterone and sharp steel. Now that we've covered the basics of honor, let's talk about shame. It was the flip side of the same coin, the dark shadow that dogged anyone who failed to meet societal expectations. Shame wasn't just a feeling, it was a social death sentence. It could lead to ostracization, loss of status, and even physical violence. The fear of shame was a powerful motivator, pushing people to defend their honor even at the risk of their lives. The fear of shame would be like someone leaking all your private data online. Speaking of shame, this brings us to the religious context. The medieval church, despite its condemnation of violence, also played a role in shaping the culture of honor and dueling. While officially opposing private duels, the church recognized the importance of justice and the need for settling disputes. Judicial combat, sanctioned by the church and state, was seen as a way to let God decide the outcome of a dispute. God will defend the righteous, they proclaimed. Sounds a bit like outsourcing conflict resolution to a higher power, doesn't it? Talk about divine intervention. But what good is understanding honor and shame without understanding the insults? The nuances of insult and slight were incredibly complex. Some were minor, easily dismissed with a shrug. Others were grave, demanding immediate redress. The severity depended on the context, the social status of the parties involved, and the nature of the insult itself. Accusations of cowardice, infidelity, or dishonesty were particularly inflammatory. It's like today when you have a whole internet forum dedicated to roasting each other, only this time you do it with a broadsword. Ouch! From insults to action, medieval life required both understanding of the provocation and the response. What was considered a duel-worthy offense? The bar was surprisingly low. A perceived slight, a harsh word, even an accidental bump in the street could trigger a challenge. It all depended on the individuals involved and their willingness to escalate the situation. It's kind of like road rage, but with significantly more chainmail. Ouch! From insults to action, medieval life required both understanding of the provocation and the response. What was considered a duel-worthy offense? The bar was surprisingly low. A perceived slight, a harsh word, even an accidental bump in the street could trigger a challenge. It all depended on the individuals involved and their willingness to escalate the situation. It's kind of like road rage, but with significantly more chainmail. Ouch! From insults to action, medieval life required both understanding of the provocation and the response. What was considered a duel-worthy offense? The bar was surprisingly low. A perceived slight, a harsh word, even an accidental bump in the street could trigger a challenge. It all depended on the individuals involved and their willingness to escalate the situation. It's kind of like road rage, but with significantly more chainmail. Ouch! A dance with death. What would you do if someone questioned your honor? Long before Twitter feuds, the answer might have been a duel, a formal, often lethal dance. From challenge to battlefield, medieval duels weren't spontaneous brawls. Think less bar fight, more painstakingly choreographed performance. The process began with an insult, real or perceived. Now imagine someone subtweeting you back in 1385. The stakes just got a whole lot higher. The offended party issued a formal challenge, a declaration of intent to settle the matter through combat. This wasn't a casual "meet me outside." It was a meticulously worded statement, often delivered by a messenger, outlining the grievance and demanding satisfaction. The selection of seconds was next. Think of them as your legal team, but with swords. These individuals, typically respected members of society, acted as intermediaries, negotiating the terms of the duel, the weapons to be used, and the time and place of the encounter. They were also responsible for ensuring that the duel was conducted fairly, according to the established rules and customs. Now, we've all had that friend who eggs us on, but imagine them egging you on to fight to the death. Key takeaway: medieval duels, not for settling minor disagreements. Speaking of rules, the legal framework surrounding duels was patchy, to say the least. In some regions, dueling was explicitly outlawed, although enforcement varied. In others, it was tolerated, even seen as a legitimate way to resolve disputes, especially among the nobility. The Church generally frowned upon it, viewing it as a form of suicide and a violation of God's law. So it was basically legal, illegal, and spiritually frowned upon, all at the same time. Key takeaway: medieval laws on dueling, clear as mud. The choice of weapons was another crucial element. Did you fancy swords, axes, lances, or even maces? The choice often reflected the social status of the duelists and the nature of the dispute. Knights typically favored lances and swords, while commoners might opt for more readily available weapons like clubs or knives. Imagine arguing over whether you get to use your favorite Call of Duty gun, but for real. Now that we've covered weapons, let's talk about what went through the duelist's head. But what good is a sword without a soul? The moral and existential weight of a duel was immense. Participants often underwent spiritual preparations, such as confession and prayer, seeking absolution for the sin of potentially killing another human being, and for risking their own lives. It was a solemn occasion, a stark reminder of mortality. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of therapy, but with a higher risk of death. Now that we've discussed the grim reality, remember, not all duels were about proving honor. Now that we have covered the preparation, let's delve a little deeper. The spiritual aspect was more than just lip service. These men were staring death in the face. The rituals, the prayers, the seeking of forgiveness, it wasn't just about placating God. It was about steeling themselves, about finding some inner peace before potentially shedding blood or losing their own. It's like prepping for a big presentation, but instead of PowerPoint, you have a sharp piece of steel. Key takeaway: medieval duels, a battle of both body and soul. Speaking of the battlefield, the location itself was often carefully chosen, a designated area, sometimes a field or a courtyard. Often these locations were thought to be neutral. The space was set apart from daily life, almost sacred, a place where earthly disputes were settled with the ultimate finality. But sometimes the battlefield was also considered a stage. The audience of peers, nobles, or even common folk who gathered to witness the event provided not only testimony, but a place of shame, should one try to flee. Now imagine if your next performance review was held in front of a live audience with swords. The duel itself was a spectacle, a performance of skill, courage, and honor. The seconds would ensure fair play, stopping the fight if necessary, if a combatant was disarmed or incapacitated. The victor? Well, he walked away with his honor intact, but also with the weight of having taken a life. The loser, if still alive, faced shame and social ostracism. But if not? Key takeaway: medieval duels, win or lose, a heavy price was paid. From location to loss, the medieval duel was far more than just a fight. It was a complex ritual governed by custom, law, and a hefty dose of existential dread. It was a dance with death, a test of courage, and a stark reminder of the precarious nature of life in the medieval world. It was a high-stakes game where the prize was honor, and the penalty was quite often death. Imagine watching two people settle a Facebook argument with swords. The contrast is absurd, isn't it? But perhaps it gives us a glimpse into the mindset of the medieval duelist, a person willing to risk everything for their reputation, their honor. It was a different world, a different time, but the human desire for respect, for validation, remains timeless. Steel and shadow, the armory of medieval combat. Ever wonder what it felt like to stand on the dueling ground, knowing your life might hinge on the quality of the steel in your hand? The medieval duel, a trial by combat, wasn't just about bravery. It was about preparation, skill, and the deadly tools of the trade. Forget those romanticized movie sword fights. This was a grim business. So what weaponry were these folks wielding? Swords, of course, but not just any swords. We're talking arming swords, hand-and-a-half swords, and even the great swords, hefty things that required serious strength. Each had its purpose. The arming sword was the everyday carry, like your medieval pocket knife, but much deadlier. The hand-and-a-half offered more reach and leverage. The greatsword? Well, that was for when you really wanted to make a statement. It's like bringing a bazooka to a knife fight, if bazookas were elegant and made of steel. But it wasn't all about swords. Axes, maces, and daggers also found their place in the dueling arena. Imagine facing someone wielding a warhammer. Not exactly a pleasant prospect. Daggers were often used as backup weapons, for close-quarters grappling, and, let's be honest, for delivering the coup de grace. It was the medieval equivalent of a hidden card up your sleeve, though hopefully with fewer sweater-related wardrobe malfunctions. Now that we've covered the edged and bludgeoning weapons, let's talk about ranged options, however limited they may have been in a formal duel. While not as common as close combat weapons, some duels, particularly those involving nobles on horseback, might involve lances. Think of it as a high-stakes game of jousting, but with significantly less pageantry and a much higher chance of death. The lance, a long wooden pole tipped with a metal point, was designed to unseat or incapacitate an opponent in a single devastating charge. It's like the medieval equivalent of a missile strike, only much slower and reliant on the horse's cooperation. But what good is a weapon without protection? Ah, armor. The amount of armor worn in a duel heavily depended on the agreement between the combatants and their social status. A fully armored knight would be a formidable opponent, practically a walking tank. But not everyone could afford that level of protection. Many duels were fought with only partial armor, or even no armor at all. The lack of armor added an element of risk, making the duel quicker and perhaps more decisive. It's like choosing to drive a motorcycle instead of a car, more thrilling, but also more likely to result in a trip to the hospital or the afterlife. Speaking of agreements, these things were important. Did both parties have the same weapons, same armor? These details were hammered out beforehand, often with lawyers involved. The goal was to ensure a fair fight, or at least a fight that appeared fair, because fairness in the medieval world was often a matter of perception, and perception was often influenced by social status and political power. It was like negotiating a business deal with the potential for lethal consequences. From weapons to armor, medieval combat demanded specialized craftsmen. Blacksmiths and armorers were highly skilled artisans, crafting these instruments of justice and vengeance. These weren't mass-produced items. Each piece was carefully made, often to the specific requirements of the client. A good armorer was worth his weight in gold, or more likely, worth a knight's allegiance. They were the equivalent of modern-day engineers and designers, but with a much greater emphasis on aesthetics and lethality. Think of them as the medieval version of Ferrari designers, but for death machines. Now that we've discussed the gear, let's address the social connotations. The choice of arms and armor wasn't just about functionality, it was a statement. A heavily armored knight signaled wealth, status, and a willingness to engage in a prolonged, potentially costly conflict. A lightly armed combatant might be signaling agility, speed, or simply a lack of resources. Your choice of weapon and armor telegraphed information about yourself, your fighting style, and the nature of the dispute. It's like choosing what car to drive. Are you going for practicality, luxury, or pure, unadulterated speed? Here's the thing. Medieval duels weren't just spontaneous brawls. They were highly ritualized events, governed by strict rules and customs. The weapons and armor were just one part of a complex social and legal framework. It wasn't just about who was stronger or more skilled. It was about honor, reputation, and the maintenance of social order. It was like a chess match, but with real consequences. So, ever wonder if the blacksmiths and armorers felt a twinge of guilt crafting weapons meant for death? Probably not. They were providing a service, and a necessary one at that. Besides, somebody had to do it. It's like asking a baker if they feel guilty about making delicious cakes that contribute to weight gain. Key takeaway: medieval duels were a deadly combination of skill, weaponry, and social signaling.
The arena is set, the combatants ready. But who else gathered, their eyes fixed on the drama unfolding? What role did the spectators, the marshals, play in a medieval duel? If you've ever been part of a crowd watching a sporting event, you have a hint. But medieval duels were a different beast entirely. Their purpose extended far beyond mere entertainment. Imagine being tasked with ensuring fair play when the stakes are life and death. Heavy is the head, as they say, especially when it's on the line. The spectators, a diverse crowd ranging from nobles to commoners, weren't passive observers. They were witnesses, their presence lending legitimacy to the proceedings. What would you do if you spotted foul play? Would you risk incurring the wrath of a powerful knight? The motivations for attending were varied: morbid curiosity, a desire to witness justice being served, or simply the allure of a spectacle. The marshals, the referees of this deadly game, held a far more active role. Appointed by a lord or the court, they were responsible for enforcing the rules of combat. Think of them as the world's most intense HR department. They ensured that weapons were of equal length and sharpness, that the combatants adhered to the agreed-upon terms, and that no outside interference occurred. This included preventing overly enthusiastic supporters from joining the fray, a task that undoubtedly required a strong arm and an even stronger sense of self-preservation. Now that we've covered the general roles, let's talk about the specifics of their duties. Marshals acted as mediators, pausing the duel to address disputes or to allow a combatant to yield. Imagine trying to calmly negotiate with two heavily armored men wielding swords, both fueled by adrenaline and a thirst for vengeance. No easy feat. They also had the authority to stop the duel altogether if they deemed it necessary, perhaps due to a clear imbalance of skill or a violation of the rules. But what good is authority without consequences? The legal and social ramifications for spectators and marshals who failed in their duties were significant. Spectators who interfered in the duel by throwing objects or inciting violence could face fines, imprisonment, or even banishment. Marshals who were found to be negligent or biased could lose their position, face social ostracism, or even be accused of complicity in a wrongful death. Think of the pressure. Speaking of consequences, medieval justice wasn't always blind. Social standing often played a role in determining culpability. A noble spectator might face a lighter penalty than a commoner for the same offense. A marshal with powerful connections might be able to escape punishment for a mistake that would ruin the career of a less influential colleague. Sure, it wasn't ideal, but that's the reality of the time. From upholding the rules to facing repercussions, medieval ghouls needed everyone. The dynamic was intricate. Now that we have understood the importance of spectators and marshals, let's dive a little deeper into how their roles shaped the entire event. Key takeaway: medieval duels were carefully orchestrated events, relying on the participation of spectators and marshals to maintain order and ensure a semblance of justice. What would you do if you were suddenly transported back to the Middle Ages and asked to be a marshal? Would you rise to the occasion, or would you politely decline, citing a prior engagement? Picture this scenario. Two knights, clad in shining armor, stand poised to strike. The crowd roars, the tension is palpable, and all eyes are on you. You are the marshal, the arbiter of this deadly contest. But medieval marshals weren't just figures of authority, they were also subject to social and political pressures. The outcome of a duel could have significant consequences for the individuals involved and for the broader political landscape. A marshal might face pressure from powerful nobles to favor one combatant over another, or to interpret the rules in a way that benefited a particular faction. Imagine trying to remain impartial when your own life or the lives of your family might depend on the outcome of the duel. It's the ultimate office politics with swords. And the spectators? They were a volatile element, their emotions capable of swaying the course of the duel. A well-timed cheer, a derisive jeer could boost the morale of one combatant and demoralize the other. But what good is cheering if it doesn't help you sleep at night? The crowd, as a collective entity, could exert a powerful influence on the proceedings, shaping the narrative of the duel and influencing the judgments of those in authority. The crowd can also, of course, turn into a mob. Modern sporting events, in contrast, have a much more formalized system of rules and regulations. Referees and umpires are trained professionals, held accountable by governing bodies, and subject to review and scrutiny. But medieval people, they had to rely on a more informal system, based on custom, tradition, and the personal integrity of the individuals involved. The difference was the absence of standardized protocols. Sure, it wasn't ideal, but when your alternative was anarchy, a duel with a marshal suddenly looked like a step in the right direction. Here's the thing. Medieval duels were more than just displays of martial prowess. They were social rituals, shaped by the expectations and behaviors of those who witnessed them. The spectators and the marshals played a vital role in upholding the norms of chivalry and ensuring that justice, however imperfect, was served. When you can't buy justice, you had to make it yourself. Key takeaway: the roles of spectators and marshals in medieval duels were deeply intertwined with the social and political dynamics of the era, reflecting the values and power structures of medieval society. Now, let's think about how these duels reflected how people thought about honor in the medieval period. What did it really feel like to be there? That's something difficult to know for sure.
The echoes of steel have faded. The roar of the crowd is but a memory. What happens when the dust settles and the duel is done? If you've ever watched a boxing match, you know the thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. But medieval duels weren't just about winning or losing. They were about survival, honor, and the complicated dance of societal expectations. Picture this: two men locked in a desperate struggle, their fates hanging in the balance. But the fight itself was just the beginning. Now that we've covered the clash of steel, let's talk about the consequences, the ripple effects that spread far beyond the dueling ground. The victor, covered in sweat and perhaps blood, might expect a hero's welcome. However, reality was often much more nuanced. Get this: even in victory, a duelist wasn't necessarily free from legal repercussions. Medieval laws, even when allowing for duels as a form of trial by combat, often stipulated penalties for causing injury or death. Think of it as getting a parking ticket after winning the lottery, a minor annoyance compared to the larger prize, but still a pain. But medieval people had very clear-cut ideas about what justice was. And even if you won the duel, it didn't mean you were free to just go home and make a sandwich. The difference was that laws were inconsistently applied and heavily dependent on social status. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was the whims of a potentially corrupt lord, the more structured legal system looked brilliant. Speaking of legal systems, the vanquished faced a far grimmer prospect. Death was, of course, the most obvious outcome. But even if they survived their injuries, the consequences could be devastating. Imagine losing a fight that was supposed to prove your innocence. Not a great look for your reputation. Dishonor, social ostracism, and financial ruin often followed a defeat. Exile was another common punishment, forcing the loser to leave their home and community, becoming an outcast. Now, exile might sound like a good premise for a road trip movie, but in reality, it meant losing everything: family, friends, and your place in the world. From legal woes to social stigma, the consequences of a duel were severe. But what about the emotional toll? Let's talk about the psychological burden carried by both combatants. Hey, ever wonder about the families involved? Victory and defeat didn't just affect the duelists themselves. Their families, too, felt the reverberations of the duel. A victor's family might celebrate their loved one's triumph, but they would also live with the knowledge that they had taken another life. The vanquished's family, on the other hand, faced grief, shame, and the daunting task of rebuilding their lives after a devastating loss. This is where you see the anachronistic reference. Family therapy wasn't really a thing in the Middle Ages, though some gossiping and advice from the local town elder might have happened. The difference being that emotional wounds weren't always treated with the same care as physical ones. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was suffering in silence, any kind of support was invaluable. Now that we've covered the families involved, let's explore the rituals that sometimes followed a duel. Sometimes reconciliation was possible. The victor might offer gestures of goodwill to the vanquished's family, seeking to heal the wounds of the conflict. Think of it as a medieval olive branch, though probably less oily and more awkward. Basically, these gestures could include financial compensation, promises of protection, or even arranged marriages between the two families. The goal was to restore peace and prevent further bloodshed. If reconciliation failed, however, the animosity could fester, leading to long-lasting feuds and cycles of violence. This is where you'd see the Hatfields and McCoys scenario playing out in medieval Europe, a never-ending saga of revenge and retribution. Here's the thing. The aftermath of a duel was rarely simple. It was a complex web of legal, social, emotional, and personal consequences. It wasn't just about who won or lost, but about how individuals and communities navigated the aftermath of violence and sought to restore order in a world often teetering on the brink of chaos. The emotional turmoil was like having your favorite lute constantly out of tune, and it was your job to maintain it. The difference was that people were made of sterner stuff and didn't always show their emotions. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was total emotional breakdown, a little stoicism went a long way. So, the duel is over. The crowds have dispersed. The victor and the vanquished face their respective fates. What have we learned? Key takeaway. The consequences of a medieval duel extended far beyond the battlefield, impacting individuals, families, and communities in profound and lasting ways.
Echoes of chivalry. The decline and legacy of medieval dueling charts the gradual decline of dueling from its zenith in the late Middle Ages to its eventual displacement by other forms of conflict resolution. It analyzes the factors that contributed to this decline, including changing social attitudes, evolving legal systems, and the rise of centralized authority. Finally, the chapter considers the enduring legacy of medieval dueling in literature, art, and modern conceptions of honor and justice, reflecting on the complex relationship between violence, social order, and personal identity. Hey,
Ever wonder when the sword fights didn't solve everything anymore? Long after knights in shining armor became more metaphor than reality, the ritual of the duel started to fade. It's not like people suddenly became pacifists, but the way disputes were settled began a slow, subtle shift. If you have ever seen a fencing match, you will remember the swift movements. The peak of dueling's popularity, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, saw these encounters as a somewhat accepted, albeit risky, way to resolve disputes among the noble class. Think of it as medieval arbitration, but with more potential for dismemberment. Now that we've covered the blood and glory of the duel, let's talk about the forces that slowly chipped away at its dominance. Like erosion wearing down a castle wall, several factors converged to push dueling towards obsolescence. The decline wasn't instant, it was a gradual change. One key factor was the rise of stronger, more centralized states. Kings and lords started consolidating power, and they weren't thrilled about the idea of their nobles settling scores outside of their legal system. Imagine trying to run a kingdom when your dukes are constantly hacking at each other. Disruptive, to say the least. Now we have rules for everything, and even lawyers to help us navigate disputes. The modern legal system felt distant back then. But medieval people were slowly, grudgingly moving in that direction. The difference was these early legal systems were often clunky, biased, and easily manipulated. But hey, sure it wasn't perfect, but it offered a degree of order that private duels simply couldn't. When your alternative was blood feuds spiraling out of control, a flawed legal system suddenly looked pretty brilliant. Speaking of flawed, shifting social attitudes played a huge role. What once seemed like a point of honor and masculinity could be seen as recklessness and pointless violence. Key takeaway: the rise of central authority and legal systems provided an alternative framework for dispute resolution, gradually diminishing the perceived necessity of duels. It's interesting to note that even within the heyday of dueling, there were always voices questioning its validity. The Church, for instance, generally frowned upon the practice, seeing it as a form of gambling with one's soul. But what good is piety when your honor's been insulted? Well, for some, religious conviction was enough to abstain from dueling, even if it meant suffering social consequences. Now that we've covered social shifts, let's talk about how evolving legal systems started to chip away at the duel's official standing. This involved slowly removing legal sanction for the practice. Remember those elaborate rules of combat we discussed earlier? Well, as legal codes developed, many of those rules began to be codified into law, taking the decision-making power out of the individual's hands. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of moving from the Wild West to a town with a sheriff. Suddenly, settling things with a gunfight was frowned upon. Now imagine the amount of paperwork involved with any sort of modern legal issue. But medieval people didn't have the same kinds of bureaucracy. The difference was that everything was based more on custom and precedent, so change was much slower. Sure, it wasn't as efficient as our modern systems, but it was enough to put a dent in dueling culture. When your alternative was anarchy, even a slow legal system was a win. From legal developments to centralized power, the decline of dueling was not caused by one thing. Key takeaway: evolving legal systems gradually absorbed many aspects of dueling, diminishing its unique role in resolving disputes. And then there's the whole question of changing military technology. The rise of gunpowder and more effective weapon systems made the individual combat prowess of a knight less crucial on the battlefield. So, suddenly, a guy like you can use a gun. So it may not be as romantic, but it sure does work. But medieval people still valued skill and bravery. The difference was, those qualities were now being expressed in different ways. Sure, the individual duel became less important, but skill at arms still mattered in war. When your alternative was relying solely on brute force, training and strategy suddenly looked brilliant. Now that we've covered some of the causes of the duel's decline, let's talk about its enduring legacy. Because even though it faded as a mainstream practice, it didn't disappear completely. Dueling left an indelible mark on literature, art, and our modern conceptions of honor and justice.
How many stories and movies feature a dramatic showdown where the hero must defend their honor? The duel, even in its absence, has become a potent symbol of courage, skill, and the willingness to fight for what one believes in. Speaking of art, let's briefly consider some more modern examples. Picture a Western standoff, two gunslingers facing off at high noon. Long before these gunfights became cinematic tropes, the duel was the original sudden and decisive confrontation. The difference was, the stakes were often higher, and the weapons were far more varied. Sure, a six-shooter is dangerous, but a broadsword can be downright terrifying. When your alternative was a quick draw in the streets, a formal duel with rules and seconds suddenly looked almost civilized. Key takeaway. Despite its decline, the medieval duel left a lasting legacy in art, literature, and our understanding of conflict resolution. Even today, elements of dueling can be seen in various forms of competition, from fencing matches to courtroom battles. The emphasis on skill, strategy, and adhering to a set of rules, these are all echoes of the medieval duel, albeit in a far less lethal form. Now, let's think about the idea of honor and how that has changed. Is honor a big deal anymore? Think about the concept of fighting for what's right. Long before social media allowed us to virtue signal from the comfort of our homes, the duel was one way people physically demonstrated their commitment to their beliefs. The difference was, the consequences were much more real. Sure, posting a strongly worded tweet is one thing, but facing down an opponent with a sword is quite another. When your alternative was silence, a duel, however dangerous, felt like a way to stand up for something. Speaking of standing up, there are some interesting ways to connect this back to modern legal battles. Imagine a courtroom showdown, two lawyers battling it out with words instead of swords. The echoes of the duel are there. The emphasis on skill, strategy, and adhering to rules. These are all elements that have carried over from the medieval era. The difference is, in a courtroom, the goal is to persuade a judge or jury, not to physically defeat an opponent. Sure, legal battles can be fierce, but they usually don't end in bloodshed.
when your alternative was settling disputes with violence, a courtroom felt like a far more rational solution. Key takeaway: the duel's legacy extends to modern legal systems, influencing our ideas of competition, honor, and justice. As our journey through the world of medieval dueling draws to a close, I hope you found some solace and intrigue in these historical accounts. It's easy to dismiss dueling as a barbaric practice, but it's important to remember the context in which it existed. It was a reflection of a society grappling with ideas of honor, justice, and the role of violence in resolving disputes. As we explored these topics, let's briefly remember these quiet moments. Thank you for joining me on this late-night exploration of medieval dueling. May your sleep be peaceful, and may your dreams be filled with the echoes of chivalry. Good night.